Thank you so much, Craig. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you, Steve, for your work that motivated today's event. On February 16th, 1970, Steve Evans watched a movie and then tried to go to bed. Yet, having just watched so many people die on screen, he was haunted by questions that wouldn't admit of easy answers. Evans recounts that evening as follows, quote, "That night, after the light on the tube dwindled away, I lay back in my bed and stared at the darkened ceiling. I felt the panic of a man in a car out of control, hurtling toward a precipice on a dark night. The steering locked, the brakes useless. Ahead loomed a plunge into an unknown abyss. In view of my death, what is the meaning of life? What meaning can time have?" End quote. Evans penned this account of the events of that night 6 years before I was even born, in his book, Despair, A Moment or a Way of Life, an existential quest for hope. Now, you should know he was only 22 when he wrote this book. Incidentally, that is the same age that Søren Kierkegaard was when he wrote his famous journal entry of August 1st, 1835, in which he also struggles to figure out what to do with his life. Announcing themes that will end up being crucial to his entire authorship, the young Kierkegaard cries out that what he must find is, quote, "a truth which is truth for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die," end quote. Along with the 22-year-old Evans, Kierkegaard here expresses his own desire for something more than what can be listed on a resume. Now, having taught 18 to 20-year-old students for nearly 20 years, I admit that I have never had any who wrote like the 22-year-old Søren or who published books on the finer details of existential philosophy like the 22-year-old Steve. But now at 43, I am a year older than Kierkegaard was when he died, though I'm still a bit younger than Steve is. I admit that I frequently return to the wisdom of these young men to help me navigate what it means to live faithfully where I am. I read and still read Evans for the same reason that I read and still read Kierkegaard, because we are who we are becoming. In his new book, Kierkegaard and Spirituality, Evans offers an account of Kierkegaardian spirituality that is deeply consistent with the early struggle of the 22-year-old Steve, searching for answers to questions that seem to be overwhelming in the dark of night. In brief, according to Kierkegaard, what it means to be spiritual is to exist such that a human self is something that one must become. This task of becoming means that one's choices make a difference. In line with the frequent tensions displayed in existential awareness, Evans' explanation of Kierkegaard's account is deeply life-giving because it means that we are not robots. What we do matters, and it matters that we take seriously what we do. However, it is also deeply troubling because if our choices do make a difference, then we must face up to the reality that what we might choose poorly. Yet the task remains. If we are who we are becoming, the question is, who then am I? For Kierkegaard, there are a variety of ways that we might answer this question as reflective of the ways that we can inhabit our spirituality. The two positive options, in contrast to spiritlessness, are what Evans terms Socratic spirituality and Christian spirituality. I think that Evans' analysis of Kierkegaard's dual conception of spirituality is incredibly helpful for contemporary Christian living for a variety of reasons. But there's one area I think is especially significant for where we find ourselves currently: the importance of embodied humility as key to the Christian practice of neighbor love. Now, famously, towards the end of his life, Kierkegaard engages in what is referred to as the attack on Christendom. But prior to the explicitly polemical turn in the last years of his life, he had long attempted to advocate the need to restore Christianity to Christendom. I think that Kierkegaard remains right in this assessment, though what counts as Christendom will require a bit of tweaking. As Evans explains, for Kierkegaard, Christendom referred to the normative association between one's social identity and one's Christian identity. Although that particular conception is fairly rare in our generally secular age, there is an increasing trend towards nationalism as a manifestation of one's Christianity. In America, this trend is currently associated primarily with Trumpism, but the specifics are less important than the broad strokes by which Christian identity is expressed not as an embrace of Christian suffering, costly grace, and the realities of lowliness, but instead as a triumphalist presentation of one's own social identity as normative for all others. Contemporary Christian nationalism is a narrative focused on religious superiority rather than spiritual humility. At its most basic, it is a failure to view God as love, but instead exclusively to view God as judge. As Evans rightly notes, quote, "To give up faith in God's love is not merely to break faith with God, but also to break faith with humanity. To doubt that God is love," Evans continues, "is essentially to give up the belief in the value of human life," end quote. Although the pandemic has certainly been marked by incredible moments of neighbor love, millions have sacrificed for others in myriad ways every single day. It has also been too frequently characterized by a failure of Christian spirituality by many who call themselves Christians. Rather than seeking to walk humbly before God while doing justice for others, as Micah 6 would encourage, many Christians have instead chosen to thump their chests and appeal to religious freedom as an excuse for not wearing masks and following public health guidelines. Rather than seeing the faces of the millions of sick and dying neighbors, they chose to clench their fists in anger about having their lives interrupted. In America specifically, the data clearly reveals that many within prominent strands of white evangelicalism, for example, are consistently likely to believe in conspiracy theories, resist COVID vaccinations, oppose mask wearing, and generally downplay the seriousness of the pandemic. Regardless of one's political orientation, this is not data that highlights the humility of what Kierkegaard terms the single individual, but instead the egoism that sees others as obstacles who stand in one's way, rather than as broken people all standing equally before God. Following Evans' account of Kierkegaard's notion of Christian spirituality, then, I want to suggest that the actual pandemic has highlighted what I will term a spiritual pandemic, whereby there's an increasing sickness of the spirit, such that one thinks that there is no relation to another that matters unless the other is someone who acts, thinks, and votes like them. Evans is clear that Christian spirituality is such that, he says, quote, "I must seek to develop a character in which I practice self-denial and continually seek to put the well-being of others ahead of my own." But this spiritual humility and other-oriented love is definitely not reflected by those who would willingly undermine democratic society in the name of their own perceived interests. One of the most prominent characteristics of this spiritual pandemic is the phenomenon of epistemic isolation. As data on group polarization demonstrates, epistemic isolation will almost always lead to a normalization of the most extreme views within a particular group. American white evangelicals, for example, were far more likely than non-evangelical Republicans to say that most of their friends were voting for Trump. Accordingly, Christendom, or perhaps even what Kierkegaard calls the demonic, has returned in the guise of the Christian obviousness of one's own political orientation and the uncritical allegiance to the power structures of that orientation. Kierkegaard's notion of Christian spirituality continues to press upon all of us in a context in which far too many Christians fail to strive to become Christian because they think that they already are there. Rather than acknowledging that in relation to God, we are always in the wrong, as Kierkegaard suggests, we find those who think that because of their relation to God, they are always right. In a time of a spiritual pandemic, the task of dying to self is seemingly replaced with callous indifference to others. As such, the category of neighbor gets transformed from a logic of radical hospitality into a logic of restrictive relationship to those who share one's religion, citizenship, and politics. Now, if I'm right about the spiritual pandemic in which Christendom, or maybe the demonic, reemerges due to egoistic nationalism and epistemic insularity, then perhaps there are reasons to be just a bit more sympathetic to Kierkegaard's own intensification of his critique at the end of his life. He might speak to our struggle to figure out the right language to describe so many Christians who seem more interested in their own comfort than in the continued realities of systemic racism, their own narrative than in the risks attendant to democratic life, and their own superiority than in the humility exemplified by a kenotic God. I read Evans and Kierkegaard at 24. I am still reading them at 43. And Lord willing, I expect I will continue to read them at 75. But to read Kierkegaard is not enough. We must allow Kierkegaard to invite us to read ourselves. Or we might say that Christian practice is the goal, not Christian perfect. We must continue to return to Evans' question from 1970. What is the meaning of life? What meaning can time have? For Evans today, accountability is the meaning of human existence. Because accountability to God and others is not something that admits of temporal finality. Christian spirituality means that we are never done with the task of becoming Christian. Now, that might sound exhausting, but in the face of spiritual pandemics, it also means that a return to health is possible. But just like the global pandemic that we are still facing, such health will only become a reality when we stop thinking that our situation can be detached from the situation of others. For example, America First philosophy needs a good dash of the Sermon on the Mount. And when we admit that uncertainty is not a cause for distrust, perhaps we can begin to realize, for example, that science, like life, is messy. In humility, then, may we walk forward together. By the grace of God, may that walk be filled with joy that comes from the sharing in each other's sufferings. Now, look, I'm glad that the 22-year-old Steve was invested in his own spiritual becoming to such a degree that he recorded the mundane experiences whereby he struggled to figure out who it was and that it matters that we try to become someone of purpose. I can't speak for others, but I can testify that in 2002, there was a 24-year-old Vanderbilt grad student who very much needed to see that it was okay to wrestle with what too often gets presented as obvious within Christianity. I can also testify that in 2021, there's a 43-year-old professor, Pentecostal Christian, and sitting president of the Søren Kierkegaard Society, who continues to need the example of Evans as a reader of Kierkegaard in order to remind himself that our decisions continue to matter, that hope remains, and that spiritual health is possible even when sickness abounds. Thank you very much.